Colonial American Hygiene, Dirt, Disease, and Wigs. When you think about colonial America, you might picture brave settlers, founding fathers, and revolution. But one thing it probably wasn't famous for was smelling good. Hygiene in colonial times was a strange mix of practicality, religious belief, and social status. Being dirty wasn't just a health issue, it was considered a sign of laziness and poor manners. Religious leaders even tied cleanliness to morality. In today's video, we're heading back to colonial America to uncover the sometimes grim, sometimes bizarre world of hygiene in the 1600s and 1700s. But before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe to the Weird History from the World channel. And drop us a comment about which parts of early American life you'd like us to cover next. Fair warning though, this one's going to stink a little. Captain John Smith, a key figure in Jamestown's survival, wrote extensively about life in the colonies, and apparently it involved a lot of bugs. He mentioned swarms of mosquitoes, clouds of flies, and even an insect the Spanish called a cucurruch, which we now know as the cockroach. Later on, a young George Washington once stayed at a bug-infested shack in the Shenandoah Valley, and complained in his journal that his blanket was crawling with lice and fleas. That experience convinced him to sleep outdoors by a campfire whenever possible. Missionary George Henry Loskiel wrote about swarms of biting insects so painful the Native Americans called them living ashes, because their sting felt like a burning coal. In those days, what we think of as a full bath was rare. Babies might get bathed to toughen them up against disease, but adults and kids barely bathed at all. Instead, they might splash a little water on their hands and face in the morning with a cloth and a basin and call it good. Wealthier folks might have a tub for sponge baths, but usually without soap, and for most people, a dip in a nearby creek on a sweltering day was the closest thing to a bath they'd ever experience. Plumbing was still a thing of the future, so people relied on outhouses, or sometimes just a simple covered pit behind the house. If you couldn't make it outside, you'd use a chamber pot inside the house, which was then dumped out the window into the yard or street. The downside, most towns and farms were dangerously close to their water sources. With no sewage system, waste ended up contaminating drinking water and spreading disease. In fact, a 2014 excavation of colonial-era privy shafts uncovered not just human waste but bottles, plates, wig curlers, tanning tools, and tavern supplies, turning old outhouse pits into gold mines for archaeologists. Sanitation wasn't exactly a top priority. Streets were littered with garbage and animal waste. Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever were common, especially in summer when heat made everything worse. Even the American Revolution wasn't spared. It's believed 2/3 of George Washington's troops at Valley Forge died from diseases like dysentery and typhoid. Ironically, those same unsanitary conditions may have worked against the British too, as Southern campaigns were devastated by outbreaks of fever and infection. Even among the doctors of the era, opinions on hygiene were divided. Some believed cleanliness prevented disease, while others clung to old theories about bodily oils being essential for health. Lacking modern science, many people turned to religion for answers. The Puritans, for example, believed cleanliness was tied directly to moral purity. A clean body, home, and town meant a clean soul. They believed water could purify both sin and sickness, and that those who bathed were less likely to fall into sin or poverty. That said, public baths were frowned upon. The Puritans thought communal bathing encouraged immoral behavior and disease. In true Puritan fashion, personal cleanliness was virtuous, public cleanliness was suspicious. And when it came to dental hygiene, well, it didn't really exist. Toothaches were common and people relied on home remedies like chamomile or figs. For serious pain, alcohol or even opium was used. Professional dentists were scarce, so if you needed a tooth pulled, you might visit a barber, a blacksmith, or an apothecary. If that makes you cringe, it should. So while colonial America may have been a vital chapter in history, it wasn't exactly a fresh-scented one. Between the bugs, lack of bathing, and questionable dental care, life was rough, dirty, and often deadly. But hey, at least it makes our modern deodorant, toothpaste, and indoor plumbing feel like small miracles. When a tooth came out in colonial America, replacing it wasn't exactly a modern dental procedure. In some cases, the extracted tooth would be placed right back into its socket, as questionable as that sounds. More often, though, people relied on dentures or primitive implants. These false teeth were typically made from wood, ivory, or metal, and sometimes even real teeth purchased from the poor, who sadly were often willing to sell them. Of course, the most famous figure with false teeth was George Washington, Folklore likes to say he wore wooden dentures, but in truth, his were made of metal wires and teeth from animals. Hardcore, right? For the record, those dentures were painful, disfiguring his jawline, and honestly, that just makes him even tougher. Among the middle and upper classes, powdered wigs were the ultimate fashion statement. Made from human or animal hair, both men and women wore them proudly while keeping their real hair shaved short to avoid lice infestations. Unfortunately, wigs weren't immune to bugs either. They required regular cleaning, ideally once a week, though many people skipped it due to the cost. Wig maintenance involved boiling them to kill lice and dousing them in fragrances like sassafras, bergamot, and bay leaves, which people believed would repel pests. Ironically, the pomade used to style these wigs actually attracted insects, making colonial hair care a total mess. Archaeological digs in Jamestown have uncovered some surprisingly personal hygiene tools. In the 1990s, a silver ear picker dating back to the 1600s was found. The tiny instrument featured a scoop at one end and a pick at the other, used for everything from cleaning teeth and fingernails to scraping out earwax. Fun fact, earwax wasn't just waste, it could be used as a substitute for beeswax to keep thread from unraveling. As you might guess, the wealthy preferred imported European soaps, known for their pleasant fragrances. For everyone else, local soap had to be either bought from nearby makers or made at home. One particularly harsh type was lye soap, created by mixing animal fat with ashes and lye. The process smelled awful, and the final product was so abrasive that it was mainly reserved for scrubbing pots, floors, and the filthiest clothes. Speaking of laundry, doing it in colonial times was backbreaking work. It involved hauling water from a river or well, heating it over an open fire, scrubbing garments by hand, and hanging them out to dry. Since it was such a chore, only undergarments and baby clothes were washed frequently. The rest, well, people wore them until they just couldn't anymore. Unlike today, colonial women didn't shave any part of their bodies. With strict moral standards dictating that women kept most of their skin covered, there wasn't much need. Shaving was risky anyway, and it was believed only skilled hands could safely do it without causing dangerous blood loss. However, historical records suggest women did pluck facial hairs and used early depilatory creams. One 16th-century beauty recipe called for a blend of limestone and arsenic, not exactly something you'd find in today's drugstore. Cleanliness, especially for women, was a major moral issue. Thomas Jefferson famously told his daughter that nothing is so disgusting to our sex as a want of cleanliness and delicacy in yours. Charming, right? At the time, doctors claimed that women's bodies could become intentionally smelly as a way to fend off unwanted male attention. One physician, Dr. Thomas Ewell, even theorized that a woman's scent could work as a form of self-defense. Something tells us he didn't get a lot of thank you notes. Meanwhile, George Washington was keenly aware of how disease could ravage an army. During the Revolutionary War, he made it clear to his officers that maintaining hygiene was crucial to keeping troops alive. Though his top concern was smallpox, dirty conditions meant there were plenty of other threats too. Soldiers were ordered to wash their hands and faces daily and clean their shirts once a week, but compliance was, well, spotty. Most soldiers preferred to let their clothes rot on their backs rather than wash them. Luckily, military camps had laborers known as followers, men, women, and sometimes children, who traveled with the army, cooking meals, mending clothes, and cleaning up after the soldiers. These camp followers were vital to the army's survival, though history rarely remembers them. They're the unsung heroes who kept colonial troops alive through some of the roughest years in American history. So what do you think? Could you have handled life in colonial times? Would you rock a powdered wig, brave a lye soap bath, or trade a tooth for cash? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're here, check out more weird history from the world deep dives you won't want to miss.